Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in this world. My name is Paul Salem. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute. I'm in Washington, D.C., and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our friend and colleague, Ambassador Martin Indyk, for a talk about his new book called Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. I exhibit it here and encourage you all to read it. I've been reading it all of last week and taking copious notes, and very eager to discuss it with Martin. Ambassador Indyk is currently a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for Foreign Relations in New York. But as you know, he's had a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Diplomatic and foreign service, particularly relating to the Middle East and the Israel-Palestine conflict. That involved ambassador to Israel a number of times, served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, was a special assistant to President Clinton, also a special envoy to President Obama on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Somebody who's really been on all parts of this U.S. peacemaking history in the Middle East, and certainly was there in the early days when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. Martin has also had a career outside and after his diplomatic career in the think tank world. He was the founding director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, one of our sister organizations here in Washington, D.C. He was also at the Brookings Institutions, where he was the founder of the Center for Middle East Policy, director of the Foreign Policy Program, and executive vice president. We meet with Martin today to discuss his new book on Mr. Henry Kissinger. Martin, let me start with this open question. This is not the first book on Henry Kissinger. There are a lot of books on Kissinger by Kissinger, and there are a lot of other books on Kissinger by other authors. Why did you take the deep journey of writing this book? What did you seek to discover that was new, and what did you come out with that really you felt was different and new and that people needed to know about? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and let me congratulate MEI on its 75th anniversary. You don't know this, but the first time I came to Washington as a graduate student doing research, the first place I went to was the Middle East Institute's library there on N Street. So I've watched it grow and thrive, and it's wonderful to see under your directorship how well it's doing now. And I'm very honored to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion with MEI as the host. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why write another book on Kissinger? Well, you're absolutely right. There have been plenty written, but there hasn't been a book written about his Middle East diplomacy. He's remembered for the other big things like the détente with the Soviet Union, or his opening to China, or the Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia debacle, or the overthrow of the regime in Chile. But the fact is that for the 4 years that he was Secretary of State, bridging the Nixon and Ford administrations, he spent most of his energy on the effort to build an American-led peace process in the Middle East. And so that was one reason why I decided to do it, especially because there's a treasure trove of documentation. The archives are open. 95% of his documents are declassified. And he made sure, as a man of history and a student of history, to document every conversation, every phone call. And on top of that, the Israeli archives for that period are open as well. So there's much to be learned from a deep dive into that. Plus, I had access to Dr. Kissinger himself and my own experience as a diplomat on the same Middle East high roads as Henry Kissinger, engaging with some of the same leaders there in my time in the Clinton administration and with Obama, I could triangulate and illuminate the story with my own experiences, and that's what I tried to do.
Thanks, Martin. I failed to welcome our audience who's joined us on Zoom. There's others who are joining us on YouTube. I'm going to be engaging Martin in a bit of Q&A for the first part of this session, but please send your questions if you're on Zoom, on the Q&A function, especially later on in the session. I will be keeping my eye on that Q&A function and pitching your questions to Ambassador Indyk. If you're on YouTube, send your questions to the following email: events@mei.edu. That's events@mei.edu. And thank you for joining us. Martin, I'd like to maybe divide our conversation initially into two parts. There is kind of the big picture, his macro approach to his general strategy to building stability and working towards peace. And then there is sort of the nuts and bolts of the timeline and how his visit to Egypt, and that's happened, the Jordanian issue, which we'll get into as kind of the blow by blow, and some of the opportunities missed or opportunities taken that you indicate in the book. In the big picture, which I've always found very interesting, and you very much root it back to his massive PhD thesis, which was about the long peace in Europe in the 19th century, engineered by Metternich and Castelrau, and his approach to building stability through building a balance of power, as you put it, as he puts it, a kind of legitimate order among powerful states. Could you lay out first what his conception or how you see it, and then maybe we debate it a bit?
Well, it was one of the things that I discovered along the way in this 8-year project. I started out thinking that Henry Kissinger was pursuing peace in the Middle East, and I could learn something from that. His efforts had been successful. The efforts that I had been involved in had some successes, but ultimately failed. And so I wanted to go back and try to understand what it meant for peacemaking. But what I came to learn was that Kissinger actually had quite a jaundiced view of peace. And indeed, you referenced his doctoral thesis, which he published as his first book, called A World Restored, Metternich, Castlereagh, and the Problems of Peace. It's right there in the title, The Problems of Peace. And that captures it. He saw peace as problematic. The pursuit of it, he argued, especially for American presidents who were seeking what he called immortality. You could also call it the Nobel Peace Prize. The pursuit of it with too much energy and passion, he argued, on the first page of his first book, could achieve the opposite. That is war, conflict. That pursuing peace was actually disruptive to the order that he considered more important. And when he studied 19th century Europe, you referred to it as the long peace. And he points out that peace was kept between the major powers for almost 100 years before it all collapsed in the First World War. And so he was taking that template and applying it to the Middle East after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And his overall approach was very similar. In 19th century, early 19th century, post-Napoleonic Europe, Castlereagh and Metternich resolved to flip France from the revolutionary power that had caused so much destruction in the Napoleonic Wars to the status quo power. And therefore, he tried to do the same thing and succeeded in flipping Egypt from being a revolutionary, revisionist state to a status quo power. But he could only do that through the mechanism of a peace process that addressed Arab grievances. He came to understand that a kind of classic balance of power, which relied on, in the Middle East case, Israeli military power backed by the United States to deter the Arabs from going to war, was insufficient, because in the end, you had the Yom Kippur War. So his idea was you had to have a balance of power and an equilibrium in the balance of power that would be bolstered by the fact that Egypt was moved from the revolutionary side to the status quo side. But you also had to have a peace process to legitimize the order and to address Arab grievances when it came to the territory Israel had occupied 6 years early in 1967. And that was the way in which you would stabilize the order. So peace itself was a problem. A peace process was the mechanism by which he legitimized the order he was trying to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's very powerful, and I've always sort of found it powerful that Henry Kissinger was one of the few secretaries of state who really came with a very thoughtful, thought-through, studied template, and that really informed his strategy and tactics and actions. And I think that's kind of a model, whether you agree with what he did or not, or his strategy, but to have a thoughtful approach to things is extremely important. But I also wonder,
he called it conceptual.
Conceptual, there we go. But I also wonder, kind of, was he bound by, a victim of whatever, in the way of his PhD thesis, that he looked at a particular period, which had its rules. He applied those rules to the Middle East. Some of it worked, some of it didn't work. It's interesting you refer indirectly to his attitude or reaction to the Wilsonian principles, Woodrow Wilson, the American president after World War I, which created a stillborn, League of Nations that didn't go anywhere, and then you had the rise of fascism and the Holocaust. His takeaway from that was, as you say, if you try to pursue peace too naively, you might end up with the worst opposite. However, those Wilsonian principles ended up, after World War II at least, informing the establishment of the United Nations, international law, the outlawing of war, a whole new order, which Steven Pinker in his recent book Enlightenment Now really takes seriously, that we shouldn't take that not seriously. Plus, when you look at European history, he looked at the 19th century and the 20s and 30s. You could also look at the visionaries like Jean Monnet and Konrad Adenauer, who figured out or decided that in order to have a peaceful Europe, you need to pursue peace. You need to, treat it directly. And that project worked in a post-war peaceful Europe. And bringing it to the Middle East, a number of reflections. I mean, it's clear that Kissinger approached his task as creating a balance of power between the major states. So Egypt, Syria, Israel, and so on, which meant stateless peoples like the Palestinians, they really don't matter in his, but then again, they're not addressed. And hence, then you have, injustice, all of what happened, and intifadas, and it becomes a problem. And secondly, what's interesting to me on the Egyptian-Israeli front is that at the end of the day, when Sadat really wanted to go for peace, Kissinger said, if you want peace, kind of prepare for war, kind of thing, have a balance of power. Sadat eventually disagreed with it. He said, if you want peace, you make peace. You just go there and you get it done. And you reflect on that in the book. And I wish you'd reflect on, does he have any regrets, any lessons learned? Do you have any lessons learned from all of these different approaches that were tried?
Yeah. Well, you make a very good point, I think. And it is, you could say, a blind spot in Kissinger's approach. First of all, he was taking lessons from the European order and applying them holus bolus to the Middle East. He didn't know anything about the Arab world by his own admission. He'd never studied or written about it. He'd never even written about the Ottoman Empire. Given his interest in 19th century Europe, you would think at least he would have some interest in that. He'd never visited the Arab world before he became Secretary of State. He'd visited Israel 6 times before he went into the White House as National Security Advisor. And he had this view of the Arabs as kind of romantics who had trouble, facing up to reality, were dreamers, who imagined that there would be some deus ex machina that would come in and change everything. And his biggest fear was that they would see in him this deus ex machina that would just deliver Israel and they wouldn't have to do anything. So that was his kind of, you could say, Orientalist view of the Middle East. And yet, there was enough of the kind of realist power dynamics in the region that his approach actually could work in terms of establishing a stable order. But there were several problems with it, and you allude to them. The first is that in his hierarchical approach to international order, it was the big powers that counted and the small powers that did not. And the only way that the small powers could count was if they disrupted the order, which most of them didn't have the power to do. And even if they did, normally the larger powers would come together and squelch them. So for the Palestinians, he regarded as a problem that needed to be addressed because they were creating some kind of static. They murdered 2 American diplomats in the Sudan on his watch. So he opened a channel to them through the CIA to the Hassan brothers. You remember them, Khalid and Hani al-Hassan. And he had this dialogue on the side. But it wasn't to advance the Palestinian cause. It was to calm them down and to keep them quiet while he went off and introduced his process. And he saw the Palestinians as a problem for Israel and Jordan to take care of. Similarly, Jordan, let alone Lebanon, really didn't count in the balance of power, given their small power status. And even though he liked the king, that's a quote, I like the king, he didn't feel that he should pay much attention to the king's concerns because they didn't really matter compared to Egypt with its size and power and role in the Arab world. If you took Egypt out of the conflict with Israel, which was his plan, then you could stabilize the region, effectively make war between the Arab states and Israel irrelevant, no longer operational. And if you could get Syria, the beating heart of pan-Arabism, to legitimize that process of taking Egypt out of the conflict, then you could stabilize it. And as for the rest, well, Palestinians, that was Israel's problem. And he kept on warning the Israelis, do a deal with Jordan. Otherwise, you'll end up with the PLO. He understood exactly the dynamic, but it wasn't important enough for him. And he told the Israelis to deal with Jordan, to sort it out, but he was never prepared to invest in it, which, as I point out in the book, was, I believe, a mistake, a product precisely of his approach, that he missed the opportunity to deal with the Palestinian issue in a Jordanian context. He negotiated disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Syria. He had the opportunity to negotiate one between Israel and Jordan, which would have put the king back into the West Bank in a limited way, but it would have given him a position on the West Bank and responsibility for the Palestinians at a time when the PLO was in no position to prevent that from happening. And Kissinger simply, he saw the opportunity, at a moment there. He kind of was attracted to it. But as soon as Nabil Fahmy, the Egyptian foreign minister, came to Washington and said, Sadat wants another deal, off he went.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Rabin wanted to deal with Egypt as well. But that as a consequence, and a real opportunity, I think, was missed, the last opportunity, as we can see historically, to put the Palestinian issue into a Jordanian context.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a couple of reflections / questions. One is kind of his, not great power, but regional great powers, let's say, regional great power approach that he took to create deterrence and balance of power and some kind of stability among the major states of the region. You could argue, has somewhat worked. There have been no major state-to-state wars since, well, the Iran-Iraq war was not exactly in his purview, wasn't his thing, but the last really state-to-state war was back in 1973. And today, really no major Arab states are at war with Israel or Israel with them. Iran is in a state of belligerence, but has never had a war with Israel and is unlikely ever to have a war with Israel. So you could say at that level, his strategy worked, made sense, still prevails in a certain way. Obviously, a lot has changed. But he did not maybe take account of two things. One is, this non-state actors. I mean, it started with the stateless people, then the PLO, and now you have a whole bunch of obviously groups affiliated in many different ways. That the Middle East is no longer a zone simply of states that you have to worry about. And I wouldn't necessarily say that is a consequence of a certain approach, but it is interesting that it's the most non-state actor-ridden region of the world.
Yes.
And secondly, that he set the U.S. on a course, including on the West Bank, which, as you say, I mean, really did not take the Palestinian issue itself into consideration and enabled and brought about for the Palestinians and for Israel and for the region, because this is, it radiates a intractable conundrum problem, which almost has no solution, but is also not, it will continue to erupt. It erupts every few years, but that too is a consequence of something he set in motion. And even, when you discuss how he thought about the Jordanian option. But even in the book, you say the Palestinians never thought the Jordanian option was an option for them. I mean, what are your reflections about sort of those?
Yeah, well, it's true. It's not that he ignored the Palestinian problem. As I said, he regarded it as a problem not worthy of his attention.
Not from U.S. Yeah.
It was Israel and Jordan that needed to deal with the problem. And he warned the Israelis, you better deal with Jordan or you'll end up dealing with the PLO. But, later on in his life, he was quite gratified that when Rabin came around to dealing with the Palestinian issue, he adopted a Kissingerian approach, Kissinger's approach was always, because he was skeptical of jumping to an end of conflict agreement, it was always gradual and incremental. He called it step-by-step diplomacy. And that's what he did with Egypt, two steps, with Syria, one step. And then he was planning a third step with Egypt and with Syria and with Jordan, actually, in his last year, that would have involved moving to non-belligerency in exchange for more territorial withdrawals by Israel. So the first point is territorial withdrawal from Arab-occupied territory was always a fundamental principle of his process. That's what lubricated the process. And so when Rabin came forward with the Oslo Accords, it was a three-phase, step-by-step, incremental approach involving yielding territory to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and no defined end game or outcome. That was to be negotiated later, and Rabin was quick to say there are no sacred timetables here. So it was kind of ironical because Kissinger had had a knockdown, drag-out fight with Rabin, as I detail in the book, in 1975 when he was trying to get Rabin to give up the strategic passes in Sinai and the oil fields, give it back to Sadat, so that they could have this second interim agreement. And Rabin was insisting in those days on a end game. He wanted peace. And Kissinger said, it's not worth having. Countries can commit to peace and they go back to war. So let's not worry about that. But Rabin at that point was insistent. The irony is Kissinger brought him around. When it came to dealing with the Palestinians, he adopted Kissinger's gradual step-by-step approach. And the ultimate irony is that we, and I include me in this, the United States, under Bill Clinton, did not appreciate Kissinger's step-by-step gradual approach. So that when Ehud Barak, newly elected, came to Washington and said to Clinton, let's end this conflict in your last year in office and my first year, let's go to Camp David, let's take Arafat there and let's end this conflict, Clinton went for it. And his aides did not argue against it, including me. We thought we could somehow end the conflict. Kissinger would have never gone for that, would have accepted that Arafat was not ready, and therefore to try to push him to it would only lead to a disaster. And I said to him in my last interview with him, did he ever regret not going for the peace treaty with Egypt? After all, Jimmy Carter negotiated the Israeli-Egypt peace treaty 2 years after Kissinger left office. And he had laid all the groundwork for it. And as I show in the book, there were plenty of indications that Sadat and Rabin were ready. But Kissinger wasn't. As I said, did you ever regret it? And he said, no. He said, because I always feared that if I pushed it too hard, I would break it. And it was like a light bulb going off in my head. It was like, yes, exactly. Yeah. That's what we did. We pushed it too hard and we broke it.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting stuff. I mean, I want to unpack a couple of elements. I mean, he does, again, have a very sort of 19th century view, and I think you just mentioned it in part of his approach to things, that peace is just, the spaces between war. It's just a few years where there isn't war, and then you fall back into war, which was kind of the reality in the 19th and 18th and 17th centuries. But it is no longer the way states actually behave in the last, post-war, certainly late 20th, early 21st. There have been no major state-to-state wars, major ones since World War II. Again, this is something Steven Pinker gets into in great detail, and I take very seriously, that it is not the case that states are sort of perpetually at war and just try to keep them out of war for a period of time, and that's the objective. That with modern economics and integration and investment and trade and so on, things are quite different. I just want to kind of put that in parentheses, but in his own approach, which you describe, which is obviously very brilliant, there are elements of buying time which are very productive towards peace and probably contributed to the peace treaties in that Carter eventually negotiated and others, which is that when states and societies are at war, they can't jump directly from war to peace. They can't do it culturally, values, emotions, trust, that you need to create a period of 10, 20, 30, 40 years where there is no war. And then it changes the dynamics so that maybe later down the road, you can talk about peace. And I think this is very relevant, even in recent conversations with friends in the Middle East, vis-a-vis Iran. None of them, they'd like peace with Iran if Iran would behave itself, but they can't see it. They don't see it happening. But they are trying to see if they can at least I don't want to say coexist, but maybe that is the word, at least not to have war for a while, and then maybe at a later date, that'll bring something better. But you also mention in the book a more negative, or one might say nefarious way of using time that Kissinger used, and you talked about it, which is buying time. It was in relation of his description of the policy towards the West Bank, that he didn't go for peace, but he went for a peace process in order to buy time to enable Israel to consolidate its hold on parts of the West Bank, which Kissinger felt were necessary for Israel's security, that giving back the 67 borders was not sustainable from his point of view for Israel, and that the buying time could also have other purposes. How would you unpack those two elements of time that were used?
Yeah, well, several things. I think he would probably, if he were talking to your Arab friends about what to do with Iran, he would introduce the concept of a détente with Iran, just like he did with the Soviet Union. And he would have no problem with that. He sees Iran as a great power, a great civilization that kind of became a revolutionary state. And in his terms, it has to decide whether it wants to be a revolution or it wants to be a state. And until it decides, and it's taken a lot longer than I think he expected, until it decides, you have to treat it as a revolutionary state and you have to contain it and deter it. And then eventually, if it's willing, you have to see whether it's willing for a détente. And I think he would see what the Arabs are doing now by talking to the Iranians to see whether there's a way to have a kind of modus vivendi. But his overall objective is to bring Iran back into the community of states as a great regional power in its own right. And he has no problem with that. He's not interested in regime change. He doesn't believe in it. Maybe he believed in it in Chile because that was in America's sphere of influence, but definitely not in the Middle East. He's not into that. Now, the question of time is very interesting because I think it's important to understand what he was talking about and what he wasn't talking about. Time for him was important because he believed that peace would eventually come. And you mentioned this. He had a Kantian view that eventually there would be peace, but it would only come as a result of the exhaustion of the powers. In effect, after trying everything else, they finally come to accept that peace is the best option. And so that's the way he viewed it. And he couldn't convince Israelis to give up territory for peace because, as I said, he had a jaundiced view of peace. So instead, he argued that they should give up territory for time to exhaust the Arabs so that they would eventually come to accept Israel, time to build Israel's strength, reduce its isolation, but not what you said, not time to consolidate its hold on Arab territory. It's true that he was against forcing Israel back to the 67 lines, but it's not so much that he regarded them as indefensible, but he regarded Israel as unable to do that at the time because of its weakness, because of its domestic political circumstances and so on. So he didn't want to try to push them to do something that they couldn't do, in his opinion. But it was not to consolidate the territory. That was the cruel irony of what happened, is that he was so successful in convincing them to accept this principle of territory for time that it became the foundational basis for their strategy towards the conflict. And in the process of buying time, which they did very well over the years, they consolidated their grip over the West Bank. And he ends up saying in his book on world order that Israel will have to yield territory. Otherwise, it will consume its moral substance if it relies on naked force alone. So it's kind of quite clear that he does not consider the West Bank as something that Israel needs to hold on to. Rather, it needs to give it up in stages, just like Rabin envisaged in the Oslo process, so that when the Palestinians are ready to accept Israel, Israel can afford then to give up the West Bank, more or less, with minor adjustments, mutually agreed swaps, etc.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's an important clarification. I misunderstood that, and thanks for the clarification. Let me try to throw in some questions here from the audience. Again, if you have questions, put them on the Q&A function, or if you're on YouTube, send it by email to events@mei.edu. Let me ask a question from Nirmal Verma, which is already an area we were sort of present in, which is taking Kissinger's worldview and view of strategy and all of that. And since you've talked to him on and off recently, what would all of this mean for U.S. policy today in the Middle East? Big question, but very relevant. What would Kissinger do?
Right. So, first of all, it's very relevant, if I could just add, because like the period of history that Kissinger was dealing with, the United States is in a retrenchment mode. It's withdrawing from Afghanistan and the broader Middle East in the way that Kissinger oversaw the withdrawal from Southeast Asia and the pullout from Vietnam. It's also a time of domestic political turmoil. Back in Kissinger's day, it was all about the impeachment of Richard Nixon and the turmoil that caused internally. Today, of course, it's about Donald Trump and the division between the Democrats and Republicans. So there's a lot of similarities in the circumstances. Kissinger's approach, and you mentioned it early on when we talked about thoughtful conceptual and so on, is always to start with a concept. And the concept depends on the balance of power. So the first requirement he would have is to establish an equilibrium in the balance of power, try to stabilize the balance of power. And in that sense, I think he would look to who are the friends of the United States that we can support, since we can no longer lead and dominate the order. We've got other things to deal with in China, Russia, climate change, etc. So let's get behind a balance of power that is supported by regional powers that are status quo powers. So that would be, the Arab Gulf states, the Sunni Arab Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. And the overall approach would be, as I said earlier, to contain and deter Iran and to forge that kind of alliance, which is already basically there in a tacit way, and support it. And that is, I think, the way he would approach it. In the case of the Palestinians, he would go back to the Oslo Accords, which, by the way, is the only agreement that still stands between the Israelis and the Palestinians, notwithstanding the fact that it's been observed in a breach by both sides. But the Oslo Accords provides for a gradual, incremental approach. The Israeli government is taking some steps, economic rather than political, not territorial. He would want to add a territorial dimension for the reasons I already explained. And the third further redeployment, as provided for in the Oslo Accords, was never fulfilled. So you could go back and get the Israelis and the Palestinians talking about that. That would be the kind of incremental territorial step which would give both sides greater confidence about where this process was leading, give the Palestinians more control over parts of Area C, which is under 60% of the West Bank, completely under Israeli control at this point, and try in that way, with the economic steps that the Israeli government has taken, to rebuild confidence and trust so that you can then approach the final status negotiations later on down the road.
Let me ask a question that is posed and link it to another one to go sort of both smaller and bigger. On the smaller side, we have all these armed non-state actors. Maybe there were very few of them when Henry Kissinger was in office. but obviously in the Middle East today, they dominate huge swaths of territory. Some kind of belong to states or are very close to states, others do not. Maybe he didn't have at the time have an approach to that issue because they weren't maybe very prevalent. Has he developed a view about how to deal with massive non-state actors that do not fit into his Westphalian balance of state power? So that's only sort of more micro view. And then a question from one of our participants here. He worked during the Cold War, where there was great power competition with the Soviet Union. That's very much part of his calculus in his Middle East policy as well. We are returning to a time where there is, resurgent Russia. There's a China looming, and that is relevant to the Middle East. So how would he or how would you, kind of being a Kissinger whisperer, attempt? How do you deal with the smaller groups, like that are not states, and the big great powers, which are not the Soviet Union, but they're a big challenge to the U.S. at least in the region? How do you think that would fit into his framework?
Yeah. So I want to make clear that I'm not speaking for Henry Kissinger.
I understand, and I'm sorry
when I answer that. No, in the sense that I haven't talked to him in detail about how he would deal with the current situation. My conversations were about how he dealt with the situation back then, because that's what I was focused on in the book. But if I try to apply Kissingerian principles to the current situation, I would say, first of all, that in terms of the non-state actors, he had no time for them. Unless they were going to become a state, then they could fit into the Westphalian order, as you refer to it. But as non-state actors, they needed to be vanquished, pure and simple. They represented a threat to the state system, and therefore they needed to be conquered by the great powers in the system. Now, the Palestinians, it was a different story, because they gained the right to self-determination. They gained that recognition from the international community and from Israel and from the United States. And so from his point of view, the question was how to develop Palestinians into a state that would have a stake in maintaining the order. And so he talks about a state in the making and the need for the Palestinians to acquire what he calls the attributes of sovereignty, which is very much fits within what Rabin was trying to do originally with the Oslo Accords. And that's, as far as I know, that's still the way he looks at it. Now, in terms of the outside powers, I think that's a very interesting question. The principle is, do they support the status quo, or do they support countries in the region who are seeking to disrupt the status quo? If Russia in Syria is trying to reestablish a stable situation, which the Russians, claim to want to do, and are working with Israel in some ways to do that, then he would be all in favor of working with the Russians on that. He never regarded Syria as a country that he needed to have in America's pocket, like Egypt. Syria had a legitimizing function, as I explained, but it was not important enough in the balance of power that you had to deny it to the Soviet Union in those days or to Russia today. The whole question is Russia prepared to stabilize Syria and prevent ISIS or other radical non-state actors from creating problems? Same with Turkey. Are they prepared to stabilize the order, or are they coming in to disrupt it for the sake of expanding their position of influence in the region? That's how he viewed the Soviet Union. And he decided that the only way to really deal with the Soviet Union was, in effect, to sideline it in the union, in the region, to push it out. So it would be judged in a kind of black and white terms. If they're ready to stabilize, then let's work with them to contain Iran, to squelch the non-state actors, to bolster the order. But if they're not, if they're going to support these non-state actors in disrupting the status quo, then you have to counter them as well.
Yeah, and that's a very important reflection on current U.S. policy and views of the region and interaction with the rising or resurgent great powers, China and Russia. You often find it just a knee jerk, and it's about great power competition. We must win, the others must retreat, and so on, without taking into account the potential common interest of a state order that everybody can benefit from, stability, absence of war. That's almost never taken into account as a measurement. But as you're laying it out, it depends what China is doing. If China is helping stabilize and build states, okay, we compete with them, but they're basically contributing to order. And if not, then they're not. So I just wanted to underline that. Let me sort of link a little bit, go back to Kissinger, but then to you, get your views. And there's a bunch of questions. Maybe let's start with the Jordanian option that you talk a lot about, but really zeroing in on the question of the Palestinians. Initially, it was, as you recount in the book, Jordan as the state would be the state option, get Jordan back involved, and the Palestinians would become part of some expanded Hashemite something or other, some federation or something. But as you say, over time, that is, became discounted, and Palestinians as a nation, a people, and then recognized pretty internationally and moving towards deserving of their own state, coming to the point where we are all the way now, where given, as you said, sort of the settlement policy and all of that, one can hardly see, let alone Palestinian leadership and divisions and problems and corruption and their own set of problems. One cannot see really a pathway to a two-state solution. One cannot see a pathway to a one-state solution. And if Kissinger's approach to peace was create a balance of power, eventually that would lead to peace. There's been such an imbalance of power between the Israelis and Palestinians that it prevents. They're too powerful. Why? But I guess boils down to, what's your view? Where are we, given your long history and understanding and struggling with these issues? What's the path? Is there a path forward? What does it look like? Whether it's an Indyk view or a Kissinger view, how can we move forward on the Palestinian-Israeli issue? Abraham Accords have done breakthroughs in other areas. We could talk about them, but the Palestinian-Israeli issue, that internal issue it's almost a civil war that's been going on since the 1920s, remains unresolved. What is the Martin Indyk view on that?
Well, first of all, I very strongly believe that it is a huge mistake for the Palestinians, particularly young, smart, highly educated, highly professional, and very admirable advocates for Palestinian cause who have been shut out of Palestinian politics. I think it's a huge mistake for them to go down the road of the one-state solution, which is where they're headed now. For me, it's a rabbit hole. It will not achieve their rights. And to abandon the right to self-determination when it has been recognized by the whole world, including Israel, is a mistake of historic proportions. It should not be abandoned. It should be rehabilitated. Palestinians should have a state of their own, and that is the only solution. One-state solutions are not solutions, they're just recipes for continuing the conflict, pure and simple. So I understand fully the argument that, it's hard to believe in the two-state solution. It's hard to imagine that the Palestinians will have a viable, contiguous state. and that Israel will ever agree to that. But I do think that it's essential to keep the hope of that solution alive. And then we go back to something I said about Kissingerian principles. The first is that the Palestinians should have a state. And the second is that we need a gradual process that involves incremental steps that get them there. And along the way, they need to acquire attributes of sovereignty. They need to become a state in the making. This was very much Fayyadism, the approach promoted by Salam Fayyad. We need to get back to that practical approach of state building and recognition. Yair Lapid, the alternate prime minister of Israel and the foreign minister now, has argued that Israel should recognize a Palestinian state with its borders to be negotiated later. That would be a Kissingerian step. But there are a lot of other things that need to be done. And Lapid has actually outlined a plan a few weeks ago, which started with a hudna, a long-term ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza that would eventually lead to the Palestinian Authority taking over in Gaza, which will only happen, as you and I know, Paul, if Hamas and the Palestinian Authority reconcile. So, there's a lot that needs to be done, but you kind of put the Abraham Accords to the side and said, well, that's a separate process. No, it is not a separate process. And it should never be viewed as a separate process. The Emiratis stopped the annexation in return for normalization. And the Saudis will not normalize unless there's progress towards a Palestinian solution. Progress towards is their position, as I understand it. And that is precisely what we're talking about here in a kind of step-by-step Kissingerian approach. Jordan and Egypt have critical roles to play. Egypt is beginning to play that role in Gaza in a way that it was not willing to do before. What is their roles? They, as states, neighboring Israel, at peace with Israel, now able to move forward with Israel because they have the legitimacy that comes from the Abraham Accords and the normalization that other Arab states have made towards Israel. You notice how they feel more comfortable about moving forward now because they're not isolated. And that's equivalent to Kissinger's getting Syria to legitimize what Egypt did. The Abraham Accords is legitimizing a role for Egypt and Jordan in the solution of the Palestinian problem. Not to impose their will to take it over, but to support the Palestinian state in the making. And Jordan has an important role to play there. These are two states capable with institutions. They can commit and fulfill commitments in a way that the Palestinians have a terribly hard time doing because they don't have those institutions of statehood. So it's that kind of approach in which is incremental, which is territorial, but also involves the Arab states, particularly Egypt for Gaza, Jordan for the West Bank, in helping the Palestinians achieve attributes of sovereignty and eventually statehood.
Thank you, Martin. That's a very detailed, excellent answer, also hopeful and realistic at the same time. Let me ask a question that's asked in a number of questions on the Q&A function, which is about nuclear weapons. Obviously, it's mentioned in the book, the issue of Israel's weapons at some point, and nuclear weapons were not a big part of the 67 war or the 73 war. The thought of using them came up in the Yom Kippur War. Yes, they were not a major factor. But let's bring it to today's world. Obviously, the Iranian nuclear program has mobilized a lot of US administrations in different ways to try to deal with this problem. Obama through negotiation, Trump through maximum pressure, Biden again through attempted negotiation. Libyan, Iraqi, Syrian programs motivated a lot of US action to try to block that. we're moving into a 21st century where nuclear power is going to have to be part of our non-carbon energy mix. I understand. I'm asking about your views. Maybe Kissinger dealt with it with the Soviets and with the Chinese, obviously not so much in the Middle Eastern context. Israel today, as you say, is extremely powerful. They're not vulnerable the way they were, many decades ago, where maybe the argument in a defensive way that they need nuclear weapons because they're so weak. Iran sometimes, although it denies wanting them, it says, "Oh, we're vulnerable and we need some protection and so on." But do you see a nuclear-free or a pathway to a nuclear-free Middle East? Is that achievable? Obviously, with Iran, it involves the negotiations that are ongoing and hopefully, pathways in that direction. Israel continues to deny or not even engage that issue. But I think it's a very serious issue for the remainder of the century. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think, again, it's kind of like the Kantian approach to peace. Eventually, you would want to get to a nuclear-free zone, and it's an admirable objective, like peace. But you can't get there from here. So, Kissinger cut his teeth on nuclear strategy. That's how he became famous as a public policy intellectual, was his America and nuclear weapons study for the Council on Foreign Relations that really projected him in the 1960s into the public policy debate. During the time when he was in the White House, he crafted the strategy of nuclear ambiguity that Israel has adopted ever since, in which the United States was very alarmed at the way in which they felt that Israel was advancing towards nuclear weapons. And so they reached an understanding, Nixon with Golda Meir, but forged by Kissinger, in which essentially Israel would adopt a policy of nuclear ambiguity, never declaring that it had nuclear weapons, always obfuscating that issue, and never doing anything that would indicate that it had nuclear weapons. And in return, the United States would look the other way about Israel's nuclear program. And that understanding continues to this day. One of the great dangers in Iran's advance towards a nuclear threshold, and you may have already seen it in reporting from Israel, so the Israelis are now talking about ending their nuclear ambiguity. And the implication would be that they would, bring the bomb out of the basement, if that's where it is, and declare themselves as a nuclear power. And the purpose of that would be to deter the Iranians from ever thinking about actually using nuclear weapons if they were to acquire them. That, in a Kissingerian approach, would be a big mistake. Why? Because it would, together with the Iranian nuclear program, trigger a nuclear arms race across the region. And so as Iran approaches the nuclear threshold, a Kissingerian approach, I'm not saying that this is what Kissinger believes, because I haven't really talked to him about it, and I'm not sure that he's thought it through. But a Kissingerian approach would be to focus on containment of Iran, as I explained before, and deterrence of Iran. And deterrence in this case would mean, in my view, extending an American nuclear umbrella to Israel and the Arab states. Why would Israel need a nuclear umbrella? Precisely so that it maintains its nuclear ambiguity, but enjoys the strength and deterrence of the United States. And the other Arab states in this kind of coalition, broad coalition that I was describing, of status quo powers that want to contain Iran, those Arab states would also enjoy a nuclear umbrella of the United States. And in that way, you could stabilize the situation and tell all these powers, you have no reason and no justification in seeking nuclear weapons because you've got protection. You've got a nuclear umbrella to protect you. It's kind of like a NATO type Article 5 commitment on the nuclear level, not on the conventional level. I mean, that's never really been discussed, but I think we're now moving into a world in which it needs to be on the table and discussed.
Well, Martin, we've run out of time. I want to thank you. This was, unlike many book talks, they've been very good. This has been extremely thoughtful. It's like kind of reading chapters of the book. So thanks, Martin, for being so thoughtful and responding to the questions and the comments in a very studied and thoughtful way. Again, this is the book that you must purchase. A very important and interesting read. Thank you, Martin, for writing it. Next time I see you, you will sign it for me, so I have an author's copy.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks for the MEI team for putting this all together. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. And Martin, I'll see you soon, inshallah. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.